Hello, Professor Beck and TESL 341 classmates. This is our project on learning from gurus, and I will be discussing a journal from Paul Nation called Keeping It Practical and Keeping It Simple. The first thing that caught my eye and stood out for me in this journal was the title, Keeping It Practical and Keeping It Simple. As educators, we're constantly being reminded and we're constantly reading and being told that when we keep it simple for students, they'll grasp the knowledge and retain information being taught for a longer period of time. So, presenting knowledge and basic principles and components is ideal. Nation talked about applied linguistics. Ideally, you want your students to apply what you've learned or what they've learned and about the language and use the information that they've retained. So to address how language is learned and taught in simple and practical ways is probably the main purpose of this journal. Notion talks about a couple of things that he touches base on, and one of the things that he touches base on is the important factor of bridging the gaps between practicing language and researching language, right? He talks about how sometimes through our writing, we come to a hump in the road where research and practice findings don't coincide. There are certain methodologies that can be used and have been shown to show great stride within our students, and they follow certain principles. But there are times in the road where within what you're teaching and what is being presented in front of you by your students, you realize it's not working. And that's where you have to use your better judgment and common sense to see what's best for the student and or the situation, right? Which leads us to looking at what technique you're using and how you're analyzing the technique, right? If you change the technique enough and there's significant growth within the student or several students, then you know that the new process or the new technique that's being used can continue to be used because it's actually working. If there's not enough significant change, then you know that we need to rethink and reevaluate how we're using this process or technique or activity and if it should be used within the classroom at all. That's why he states that it's really important to kind of set your own principles that'll allow you to be more flexible with what's being taught and the activities that you're using within the classroom. He talks about writing and gathering ideas and helped him organize his plans as a teacher and as an educator, which also caused him to be able to publish several books. It can show that there are more than one effective way or one effective technique to teaching language, which leads me to talk about principles and methodologies, right? With principles, they're philosophies and they're assumptions that normally don't change, and methodologies are devices that help apply the principles and usually are changed. Methods are like direct method teaching or grammar translation, total physical response, commutative language. Though these methodologies are different, research has been proven to be effective, but overall, it is the principle that affects the change, not the method. And at times, changing the method or changing the technique can still help a student reach the same principle. Notion also talks about through his travels, he was a part of programs where teaching English was also a requirement as long as you were also training others or other teachers and educators. And this was ideal because it helped you journal and share amongst colleagues, which in the long run um, helped teachers advance and communicate with one another on what was actually working, which in turn helps with research and gives teachers an additional resource in techniques and methodologies that can be used. Overall, I state this, and he states that the important factors are that, excuse me, sorry about that, that sorry for the small pause, but I can go back to the fact that Notion believes that um, there's more than one effective method to teaching language, which leads me to talk about his methods, which weren't truly methods. They were different methods put together and borrowed based off principles. They're called the four strands. First principle is meaning focus input, where it's very similar to the audiolingual method, where he uses reading, a graded reading and podcast and recordings to focus on the receptive skills of a student. And then he goes on to a meaning focused output, which talks about writing and speaking skills and productive skills of a student, where he has journal writing and storytelling, oral communication, which kind of comes into a commutative method. Then he has language focused learning, where there's explicit language or learning of language, pronunciation, spelling, vocabulary, and grammar, which is more in the grammar translation method. So he borrowed from various other methods to obtain techniques and activities within those four principles and use those in the classroom. His last one is fluency development, which helps develop the receptive and productive skills of the student by using things that they're familiar with, not introducing new language. He uses speed recovery or speed reading, repetitive writing, and speaking, which grabs onto the rote memory aspect of learning language. Overall, this is what the journal encompassed and talked about, which doesn't change what we in turn are learning in the classroom. We've learned about all these different methods throughout TESL 341, and our job is to take on these methods and take from them what's going to be best for us to use in our classrooms and with our students. I think some of the things that I've learned about Paul Notion are that he comes from New Zealand. He's a recognized international scholar in the field of linguistics and worked for IBM for years. He traveled to Indonesia and Thailand, USA, Finland, and Japan, and also taught at these areas. His key concepts were word fluency and vocabulary, and was very, very influential to a lot of other people in applied linguistics. He's now 77 years of age and is still a good mentor to have while learning applied linguistics. Have a great evening. Before I go, there's one thing that I did omit to talk about, and that was if I was to meet Professor Nation, what kind of questions would I ask him and why about his four-strand theory? I would ask him, what drove him to choose the 4 principles that he's chosen, based off all of the linguistic principles that he could have chosen from. Also, to learn more or talk more about how in depth his techniques or activities are for each one of those 4 strands, that enhances the ability for his students to be able to grasp the language easier and more efficiently. And with that, I conclude my Guru Knowledge Project. Thank you and have a great day.